Vagrant Story has a reputation for being a difficult game, amongst the hardest that Square has ever produced. As director Yasumi Matsuno put it, unlike the Final Fantasy series and Metal Gear Solid, Vagrant is geared toward hardcore gamers. However, I don't like to use the terms difficult or hard to describe Vagrant Story. I think it may be more accurate to call it confounding. Rather than requiring the player to develop a special skill, the key to conquering this game lies in understanding its various systems, a fact not helped by its unintuitive menu design. The aim of this video is to provide a clear guide to understanding the game's systems and features to mitigate the almost inevitable confusion for first-time players. Many of the details given here can be found in the game menu's quick manual, but will hopefully be easier to take in using this video format. Tip number 1, opening movies. The first thing any new player to Vagrant Story needs to know is simply to put the controller down before choosing new game, as there are 3 movies that play, one of which is essential. First off is the generic hype FMV, but once this ends and you reach the start screen, you have to leave it alone. Just pause there, don't touch the controller, because after this an all-important briefing prelude begins, which really sets the stage for the game. As this one finishes, the FMV replays, and then leaving it again once it reaches the start screen shows a new trailer-style video. This is actually sort of an abridged version of the opening scene when you press start. It's edited a little differently, it's played in a bit of a different order, and it moves a lot faster, but there's some really key exposition given on these black screens with text that you don't get in the official version of this scene when you start the game. This might seem like a small difference, but this is actually the only in-game asset that tells us the framing device of the story. But it does so largely by using condensed scenes from the actual opening of the game. And watching it right now is not super important, but I would still recommend doing that. Once at least this prelude video has been seen, then a new game can be started. Okay, and this is important too. While the opening sequences here are interactive, be sure not to impatiently press start, because if you do that, you're going to skip the entire intro of the game and be put into Le Monde, which comes after the opening sequence of the game. You'll be totally lost if you do this. Tip number 2, basic combat. During the opening, we get our first taste of combat as we fight 2 cultists. Close in on an enemy and press circle to bring up the targeting sphere. Choose which body part you want to hit, then press circle to confirm. With the targeting sphere open, we can see displayed at the bottom the expected damage and probability of landing the attack. Some specific body parts may be more vulnerable to certain types of weapons than others. The teal figure on the bottom left displays the health of Ashley's body. As he takes hits, the colors of different body parts will eventually change to red to indicate that said body part is dying or is broken, maybe. Different body parts reaching this status have different effects. With a dying head, he can no longer cast magic, right? Because it's affecting his mind. Dying legs cut his movement speed. A dying body increases his risk. A left arm decreases his parry chances, and the right arm decreases attack power. These inflictions can also hold true on damaged enemies. So, as an example of a strategy you might want to use, if you're fighting an enemy mage, it may be better to attack their head, which will affect their ability to cast magic, right? And that might be key to defeating that enemy. Tip number 3, weapon damage. Opening the targeting sphere also displays the kinds of damage your equipped weapon will inflict. There are 3 categories: type, affinity, and class. Type is simply what the weapon is, right? So blunt, edged, or piercing. Most swords are edged, and maces are always blunt, etc. Affinity is the elemental energy accumulated in the weapon. These are physical, air, fire, earth, water, light, and dark. Class refers to the type of enemy you are facing. So there are human enemies, beast enemies, undead enemies, phantom enemies, dragon enemies, and evil enemies. Using the cultists as an example, we see edged, physical, human, telling us that we have an edged weapon dealing physical damage against a human enemy. These factors are displayed in descending order of importance. The type of blade, and then the affinity, are much bigger factors than the weapon's class in determining the total damage. However, both the class and the affinity values of a blade or armor can change by using them in battle. The more they are used on enemies, the better they become against those types of enemy. By turning a certain menu option on, you can track these changes as they happen. Just note that as one property goes up, another may go down in its place. The two that are listed below the one that you are increasing may decrease in response. With affinity, each element has an opposite. For example, fire and water, right? Those are opposites. And physical opposes each of the other 6. Further into the game, you'll find gems and spells that can quickly alter affinities to your needs. Tip number 4, item and status menu. As mentioned before, menu navigation is unintuitive, particularly the items and status menus. Most other menu options are easy enough to grasp, so I'll only go over these 2. Entering the items menu brings up 8 sub-menus from equipment to consumables, but confusingly, only the 2 on opposite ends are ones that allow you to do anything. The middle 6 are just for checking statuses and reordering or discarding various types of equipment. The last one on the right, labeled Miscellaneous, is the consumables menu, where you can use items for various effects. The menu on the far left, however, allows you to set or modify your equipment, though some of its options are only available in workshops. The 6 middle submenus are weapons, blades, grips, shields, armor, and gems. You can examine your gear in greater detail from here with the square button, but cannot equip or modify them. You can also see how close you are to filling out Ashley's carrying capacity. Using this clunky interface is very slow, as to do anything from it you need to double-click, as long as you aren't manually reordering, in order to bring up another menu to choose what to do next. Keep in mind, though, that most actions in the game will be done through the much faster L2 shortcut menu. When looking at the stats of any weapon, the screen shows what seems to be a massive jumble of information, so let's break it down a little. At the very bottom of the screen, there's some flavor text, as well as the type and material of the weapon. The 2 gauges in the top left corner are the blade's damage points, or DP, and phantom points, PP. As you use weapons, they lose damage points but gain phantom points. When the damage point gauge is depleted, the weapon is only 50% effective until repaired. When the phantom point gauge is full, the weapon's effectiveness is doubled. Phantom points are also spent to repair damage points in workshops. The chart in the lower right tells you the base effects of the weapon, in the left column, as well as the total when combined with Ashley's stats, in the right column. Range affects the size of your targeting sphere. Risk is basically the accumulation of points that comes from each successful blow that you land. Strength accounts for physical attack and defense. Intelligence is magical attack and defense, and agility is the accuracy of attacks. Lastly, the big chart on the left displays the type of damage the weapon will do, and you press square to look through the 3 different modifiers. Note that in the affinity and type pages, only one stat is not grayed out. The grayed out ones are irrelevant to the current weapon, as only the strongest affinity and actual type have an effect, whereas the relevant class value to the enemy will always apply. As for the status menu, this will usually only show Ashley's status, but if there are enemies in the same room, you can also examine their statuses here by pressing the L1 and R1 shoulder buttons. Normally, you can only see their general health status and the names of any equipment they're carrying, but once you have the analysis spell, you can gain the precise numbers on the weaknesses for both of these and their equipment. Press circle to choose specific pieces of equipment to examine, and square to switch between class, affinity, and type. Note also that there is a percentage chance of an enemy dropping any of the equipment that is seen here upon dying. Tip number 5, further combat. While there is unfortunately no way to quick change weapons during combat without going through the menus, most other abilities can be quickly accessed through the shortcut menu by holding L2. At the start, Ashley can only access consumable items this way, but as he gains additional skills, their menus will be accessible from here also. Ashley has 2 modes he can use, Exploration Mode and Battle Mode. In Exploration Mode, Ashley can climb ledges and move boxes. Press circle to enter battle mode and X to cancel it. In the top left, you can read Ashley's overall HP, MP, and risk. HP and MP are self-explanatory, but risk is unique to this game, though battle fatigue may be a better description for it. Every weapon has a risk value, and the more strikes you make with that weapon, the more points they add to his risk bar. As risk increases, Ashley's accuracy will plummet, and he becomes more vulnerable to damage. Once Ashley gains the ability to chain attacks, the faster blows will cause his risk to skyrocket. To decrease risk, you need to use an item called Vera in the heat of battle. When you're outside of battle, risk recovers very quickly on its own, twice the speed of MP and quadruple the speed of HP. Tip number 6, magic. After defeating the first real boss, Ashley is rewarded with his first 2 magic spells in the form of grimoires. Reading a grimoire casts the spell contained within, which Ashley can then recast at any time. Spells are sorted into 4 categories: Warlock, which is attack spells, Shaman, which is recovery spells, Sorcerer, aid spells, and Enchanter, affinity spells. In this game, the meat of the magic spells comes from the buffs and debuffs found in Sorcerer and Enchanter. With these, you can increase your own stats and decrease your enemy's stats, and this is pretty much essential for most bosses, but is useful in any fight, really. Just bear in mind that the number of buffs and debuffs that you can cast on a single enemy is limited to 1 on their main body and 1 on their equipment. Applying a new effect will only replace the other one that had been applied before. The first 2 spells you receive are a debuff for your enemies, which will decrease their strength and defense, and the other one will basically be your main healing spell. As a special tip, the healing spell is more powerful in battle mode because your weapon's magic stat is added to Ashley's base magic stat. You'll also heal more damage when your risk meter is higher, as he is more vulnerable to all kinds of magic. Tip number 7, battle arts. After trying to leave the room where you fight the first real boss, Ashley gains access to various offensive and defensive abilities. These can be linked to the triangle, square, and circle buttons from a list in the main or shortcut menus. Every time you successfully land one of these abilities, you earn points toward learning new ones. Defensive abilities allow you to utilize various effects by pressing one of the 3 buttons the moment an enemy attack lands on you, as indicated by a big red exclamation point above Ashley's head. These can mitigate some of the damage, reflect some of the damage back onto the enemy, absorb MP, and so on. Even enemies who are near impossible to damage can be killed simply by reflecting their own damage back at them if you become good at this. Offensive ability chains are much more meaty. If you press one of the 3 buttons just as your first strike lands, Ashley will follow up with a second strike that uses the chosen effect. Pressing a different button as this one lands allows you to strike again, and so on for as long as you can keep alternating abilities and getting the timing right. These also have a number of effects, and it's best to make sure to set at least one ability to increase damage to the enemy, though these percentage-based abilities are dependent on the first strike succeeding. If you don't succeed on the first strike, then you might as well just end the chain because none of the rest of your attacks are going to do anything. The longer a chain continues, the more damage you can do without giving your enemy an opportunity to strike. The downside to chaining is that it rapidly increases your risk meter, and some weapon types or chain abilities make it much harder to get the timing right. It takes a lot of practice in order to get the timing down for this, and each weapon that you use will have a different animation, which requires different timing. So this is hard to master, but if you can do it, it can be really, really effective. Tip number 8, break arts. Personally, I like to use break arts in this game more so than the chaining abilities. Every time you land a killing blow with each category of weapon, so daggers, swords, great swords, axe or maces, great axes, heavy mace, pole arms, crossbows, staves, and even bare hands, you add a point to that weapon category's break arts. So after 20 or so kills with that specific weapon type, you unlock that weapon's first break art, of which there are 4 total levels. These break arts are special attacks that can do high damage at vast range and don't increase risk at all, but they will require a sacrifice of your own health points. Break arts can also change the type of damage your weapon inflicts, and sometimes add extra effects such as debuffs as well. These provide you with more options to use when probing an enemy for weaknesses, and used correctly, these abilities can turn the tide of a fight. Tip number 9, workshops, repair and assembly. Scattered throughout Leomond are workshops kept stocked by Molenkamp, which Ashley can use to repair and modify his equipment. Continuous use of equipment accumulates both damage and dark energy. And in the workshops, Ashley spends this energy, this is the phantom points we were talking about, to repair the damage, or the DP, through the item setup menu. Keep in mind though that phantom points drain when Ashley is in battle mode, so drop that mode when you're not in combat. All of your equipment can be repaired in any of these workshops. There is a limit on how much equipment Ashley can carry though. He can carry up to 16 blades and grips, but only 8 of these can be combined into a full weapon at any time. Any new weapon he finds after 8 has to be broken down into its component parts to try to make room for them. Be sure to leave room for new gear by storing spares in the connecting chests. Equipment can be broken down in the field, but only assembled in workshops, with the exception of gemstones which can be swapped around at any time. To make a weapon, you simply need a blade and a compatible grip. The blade carries the class and affinity values of the weapon and sets the blade type, but the actual value of the type damage comes from the grip, as does the capacity to hold gems, if at all. So when assembling a weapon, you need to choose a grip that adds as much value to the right blade type as possible, while also, hopefully, providing gem slots. Tip number 10, workshops, combining. When you enter a workshop for the first time, or read its board, it will tell you what types of materials are compatible with that workshop. What this actually refers to is only the combining section of the equipment menu, not the assembly or repair sections. Blades, armor, and shields can be crafted from a number of metals. You have bronze, iron, Hagane, silver, and Damascus. Shields can also be made from wood, and armor can also be made from leather. You can upgrade all your armor, blades, and shields separately by combining them with other versions that you find and gradually improve them, but only in workshops that are compatible with that material. You can also sometimes upgrade the material by combining with a higher quality one. So for example, mixing bronze and iron will always result in a Hagane, but the ability to do this again will depend on the workshop. So, these massively complicated charts will tell you exactly how all the combinations work, but you don't need them. All you need are the little end pieces. When you cross categories for weapon types, for example a sword with an axe, you will almost always end up with an inferior version of the new weapon. So only combine type with type, such as dagger with dagger or helm with helm. Combining equipment into stronger types allows you to retain the points you've earned in combat for that weapon, while increasing the base stats of the weapon. Just be careful you don't accidentally downgrade your stats while you're doing these combinations. Now, while there is value in having a variety of weapons to swap around, you don't have as much leeway to do this with armor. So just concentrate on upgrading one set as often as you can, instead of trying to keep a large number of sets for multiple purposes, which will only end up using that extra space that you need for accessories. There's more to it than this, and using a chart helps, so don't be intimidated by the overall size. You only really need to follow a small section at a time. Experimenting on your own, however, is of course just as viable. So, we've come to the end of our 10 tips here, and there are more that I would like to share, but I'm going to put them in the pinned comment. So if you're not completely intimidated by this tidal wave of information that you've received so far, go and check out that pinned comment where there will be some extra pieces of advice. I want to give a special shout out to one of our patrons, Chocolate Rob, who actually wrote this script and guided me on my first playthrough of Vagrant Story. He is exceptionally knowledgeable about this game, and if you follow his tips, I promise you will be able to conquer this game. It can be very intimidating and very frustrating, but once you understand the tool set that's been given to you by the developers, it's really not so bad. We are going to be starting our podcast series on Vagrant Story this week, so if you would like to join us, take these tips into consideration, and we'll see you real soon with a breakdown of the game's story, which for me is the reason to play the game.